Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into a really fascinating and honestly quite tragic paradox that's unfolding right now in the Rif Mountains of northern Morocco. So back in 2021, the government actually legalized cannabis for pharmaceutical use. The whole idea was to boost a historically impoverished region. But taking a massive, decades-old illicit industry out from the shadows and making it totally legal, well, it turns out that is incredibly difficult. We're going to break down exactly why Morocco is struggling with legalization and why this policy just isn't delivering the utopian promise that so many people hoped for.
Right off the bat, you might be wondering about a massive contradiction here. I mean, why would a farmer, someone who has lived in constant fear of the police, arbitrary arrests, and systemic corruption for literally 70 years, actually hesitate to just step into the light and go legal? You'd think legalization would be a huge sigh of relief. But, as we'll see, transitioning from a decades-old illicit trade to a highly regulated official supply chain is packed with roadblocks, and these roadblocks are pushing small farmers to the absolute brink.
Okay, to understand the stakes, we first have to understand the crop itself. Cannabis sativa has a pretty complicated global reputation, right? It's best known for THC, which is the psychoactive stuff in marijuana and hashish. But the tiny droplets of resin on these plants also contain compounds like CBD. And CBD has these amazing calming, anti-inflammatory, and therapeutic properties without causing any intoxication. And there's a real irony here, because it's actually this booming global demand for CBD, the stuff in trendy wellness oils and creams across Europe, that sparked Morocco's entire legal transition in the first place.
So let's look at how we got here. Prior to 2021, the Rif Mountains operated under very strict prohibition. But despite the ban, cannabis was widely harvested and sold, which fueled a massive black market. Then, the government stepped in. They decriminalized the plant specifically for pharmaceutical and industrial uses, aiming to bring security and actual prosperity to these small-scale growers. But fast forward to today, and the transition is really struggling. It's attracting far fewer farmers than anyone expected, and it's leaving the community totally divided on whether they should even participate at all.
And you might think, well, why don't they just pivot to growing tomatoes or wheat? Well, the Rif Mountains region has a really harsh climate, super poor soil, and suffers from severe drought. It's tough. But despite those terrible conditions, cannabis thrives. In fact, to put it into perspective, cannabis farming brings in about 10 times the income of alternative agricultural crops. 10 times! If your family's survival is on the line, the choice is pretty obvious. This isn't just a business preference. It is quite literally the only thing that reliably grows and pays the bills.
Which brings us to the first major hurdle, the bureaucratic bottleneck.
So if the legal market is officially open and the crop is highly lucrative, what is actually stopping farmers from jumping in? Honestly, the reality on the ground is completely exhausting. To go legal, a small-scale farmer can't just plant seeds and sell them down the road. First, they have to officially join a licensed cooperative. Then they have to submit precise GPS tracking and topographical data for their fields. After that, the entire production chain goes through incredibly strict hygiene and contaminant inspections to meet European pharmaceutical standards. Imagine asking traditional off-the-grid mountain farmers to suddenly master a highly rigid, digitized system just to secure a buyer in Europe. It's a massive culture clash. Right now, there are about 350 licensed cooperatives across the country trying to make this whole thing work. These co-ops essentially act as the middlemen for the legal market. They aggregate the crops, store the cannabis in heavily monitored warehouses, and try their best to jump through all of these complex exporting hoops on behalf of the farmers.
But that red tape leads right into our next issue, the economic squeeze.
Administrative hurdles are really only half the story when it comes to why Morocco is struggling with legalization. You see, the law on paper is beautiful. It promises legal protection, shared profits, and a legitimate, peaceful livelihood totally free from police harassment. But the reality on the ground, it's a completely different story. Farmers are harvesting their crops and dutifully handing them over to the legal cooperatives. But because Moroccan exporters are having a really hard time finding European buyers who will actually accept their products under those super strict EU pharma standards, the crops are just sitting in warehouses. So the farmers are left holding an unpaid receipt, waiting weeks or even months to see a single dime. And this creates a literally impossible dilemma. While they're waiting for the legal system to process their payments, real life doesn't just hit pause. Because they traded their only source of income for what is essentially an IOU, they cannot afford the basics. We're talking about everyday necessities: cooking oil, sugar, clothes for their kids, and medication for the sick. It's heartbreaking. As the locals will tell you, legal protection is great, but it doesn't put food on the table.
And all of this is compounded by a legacy of distrust. Beyond just the economic strain, Morocco struggles with legalization because of a deeply damaged social fabric. For decades under Prohibition, the system was entirely rigged. The black market created some very clear winners: corrupt officials pocketing bribes, middlemen intentionally driving down prices, and wealthy landowners running massive operations remotely from the city. And on the losing side, the small farmers. They were fighting drought, piling up debt to local lenders, and living in constant terror of arbitrary police enforcement that was basically used for extortion. The authorities historically used drug laws to intimidate locals, keeping them completely trapped in a cycle of poverty.
This history brings us to a really tragic cultural fallout. Because of that constant fear, corruption, and intimidation, the old community spirit has been totally eroded. Farmers who used to pitch in to help each other pay medical bills or support a neighbor during a family loss are now fiercely suspicious of one another. They live in a culture of paranoia, where neighbors might even invent stories or collaborate with undercover police just to eliminate their competition. That feeling of solidarity, it's pretty much gone. It's become everyone for themselves.
To really understand this, let's look at A Family Divided, the El Morabits. Seeing how this policy plays out inside a single home really grounds the issue. The El Morabit family perfectly encapsulates the painful divide this new law has created. On one side, you have the father, Mohammed. He's nearly 70 years old and he's been farming cannabis since he was a kid. He made the bold and frankly risky decision to join a legal cooperative. Why? Because after a lifetime of looking over his shoulder, of hiding and being extorted on the black market, he just desperately wants peace. For him, the promise of legal protection and running a legitimate enterprise is totally worth the growing pains of a new system. But then, immediately contrasting this is his son, Nabil. Nabil looks at the exact same situation and just sees a disaster. He rightly points out that the law only exists on paper. He looks around at his neighbors who are holding those unpaid receipts, entirely unable to feed their families, and worse, Nabil sees that even the legal growers are still dealing with police harassment and neighborhood informants who are just jealous of their supposed new European wealth. So from the son's perspective, going legal offers absolutely zero tangible financial benefit right now.
And this creates a really heartbreaking generational trap. First of all, there's no going back. Once a farm is registered legally, selling on the black market again to make some quick cash would jeopardize everything and risk severe prosecution. Second, strict cultural and religious norms in Morocco dictate that Nabil cannot override his father as the head of the household. What the father says goes for as long as he's alive. So young men like Nabil are left feeling entirely trapped on a farm that isn't making any money. For a lot of them, migrating to Europe looks like the only remaining alternative for a viable future.
So, we want to leave you with this final provocative thought to consider. Taking an illicit industry out of the shadows and integrating it into a highly regulated global pharmaceutical market is undoubtedly a noble goal. It sounds fantastic on paper, but if the legal structure is so incredibly burdened by red tape, export bottlenecks, and payment delays that it actually starves the very farmers it was meant to save, we really have to ask, who is this reform actually for? It's a powerful reminder that passing a law is only step one. Building a system that actually works for the people on the ground, that is the true challenge. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and we'll see you next time.